And tonight on Where Did the Road Go, we've been talking to Robert Schoch. We're going to go an extra hour tonight. So the last exit for the Lost will be up at 1 a.m. tonight instead of 12, which usually ends up being after 12 anyway. Robert is the author of a book called Forgotten Civilization, which is fantastic. And you're with us, Robert.
I am.
And your book came out at the end of last year, correct?
That's correct. And yes. I hope everyone will read it, and I'm not saying that, I want to be clear, this is absolutely true. I'm not saying that because I'm trying to sell books. I'm trying to sell information, if you would, or make information available because, as you know, you've read the book, I believe there's a lot of valuable information in the book which pertains to us to this day, in the real time, real world today. It's not just ancient civilizations sort of in a voyeuristic sense of, oh, aren't they neat to study, aren't they neat to learn about. I think there's a real message for us today, especially as we watch the news and the sun is ramping up and we could experience, I think we are starting to experience, should we say, natural events that ancient civilizations already went through in the past.
Well, and I think that's something people don't always understand. They do look at it voyeuristically. Oh, look what these people did. That's really neat. That's really interesting. But they don't realize how relevant it is to us today because these cultures may have known more than we did. They may have actually been more advanced, but in different ways. And something happened to them. And if it happened to them, it very well will likely happen to us, or something similar could happen to us.
Exactly. It's I'm a geologist, and it's a virtual truism in geology that when you find something happened in the past, it's going to happen again. You know, you see big earthquakes and volcanic activity and asteroids hitting or major solar outbursts. You know, as a geologist, it's not a matter will that ever happen again. It's just a matter of when will it happen again.
Yeah, let's jump over to Egypt real quick. We never really talked much about Egypt. We talked about the reaction you got from Egyptologists and stuff, but you got into this by dating the Sphinx at a much older time, which we referenced briefly earlier. Mm-hmm. What about the pyramids? Do you think the pyramids are accurately dated?
It's a subtle question. The answer is probably no.
Okay.
Currently, the pyramids that we see today on the Giza Plateau, there's a lot of pyramids in Egypt. People should realize that. There are literally dozens of pyramids in Egypt. So they all have different dates. But I think when you say the pyramids, or at least most people, when they say the pyramids, they're talking about the three pyramids, the three most famous pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Mm-hmm. Those pyramids are dated to about, 2550 to 2450 or somewhere in that range, BC. So, 4,500 years ago in rough terms. And this ties in with the Sphinx. My work on the Sphinx, the traditional date for the Sphinx is about 2500 BC, 4,500 years ago. And I started my career, if you want to call it that, in ancient civilizations by going to Egypt in 1990 and first looking at the Sphinx from a geological perspective. And just to reiterate a little bit, or to review for people that might not be that familiar with the story, I determined that the core body of the Sphinx, the oldest portions of the Sphinx, go back thousands of years earlier. Initially, I thought it was about 5,000 to 7,000 BC. I would now revise that even earlier. I have no problem at this point suggesting that the core body, the oldest portion of the Sphinx, actually goes back to Göbekli Tepe times. That goes back to the end of the last ice age. So when you look at the Sphinx, it has to do with weathering features and tying that in with climatic changes, because you see weathering on the body of the Sphinx that was clearly caused by precipitation, clearly caused by torrential rains. And you have those at the end of the last ice age. It's very different than the weathering caused by hyper-arid conditions, basically desert conditions of the Sahara, which is what you have over the last 5,000 years. So I'm getting to the pyramids. So when you look at the core body of the Sphinx, it goes back much earlier. And in fact, I would say that, that's sort of become established now. There's really no denying it. And the Sphinx itself is sort of a hybrid because the head of the Sphinx is a much later head. Probably it was a lion originally. That's my suggestion. The body was heavily weathered, the head would have been heavily weathered, and in dynastic times, the head of the Sphinx was recarved to look the way it does now. It's clearly, in my assessment, a recarved head and a dynastic head. So in the Sphinx, you have something that's much older, but it was reused in dynastic times, and the head was recarved. So you sort of have a hybrid. When you look at the pyramids, I suspect that you have essentially the same type of scenario where you have much older structures that were reused, refurbished, rebuilt in dynastic times. My colleague and friend Robert Bouval has worked a lot on the pyramids, and I'm sure many people are familiar with what's known as the Orion correlation, that the three pyramids on the Giza Plateau, in fact, represent the three belt stars of Orion, the constellation Orion in the sky, and Orion itself is representative in ancient Egyptian mythology of Osiris, the god Osiris. And Robert Bouval established that correlation, which I think has really stood the test of time. And something about his Orion correlation is that, yes, it looks like the belt stars of Orion, but in fact, when does it match the night skies the best? Not in the present day, not in 2500 BC, but about 10,500 BC. So this again suggests that things are going on much earlier on the Giza Plateau, and in this case focused on the pyramids. Now, Robert Bouval himself, would not necessarily say, and I've talked to him about this many times, that the present pyramids are 10,500 BC, but that they mark positions on the plateau from that earlier period. When I look at the current pyramids, I think that in the case of the Great Pyramid, you have what's known as a subterranean chamber. It's deep in the bedrock under the current pyramid. I think that goes back much earlier as a physical structure. What you have with the Great Pyramid was initially a sacred mound. There's, to this day, a mound under the Great Pyramid. It's a rock mound and the subterranean chamber that goes deep beneath it. So I think that's the primary structure, or the earliest structure. Later it was built up, in my assessment, as essentially a platform up to what's now the current 50th level of the Great Pyramid, including the Grand Gallery and the Queen's Chamber. And then later it was added to once again, and the final touches, if you would, or the final version of it was probably completed in Old Kingdom dynastic time. So you have a structure that was used and reused and built upon and modified. The same with the second pyramid. It has a ring of granite around the base, and granite was used typically in dynastic times to indicate that they were refurbishing or restoring more ancient structures. So this is a ring of Old Kingdom granite around the base, which I think clearly indicates, they are trying to clearly indicate that this is an older structure that they're refurbishing, that they're restoring to a certain extent. And you see exactly the same thing on what's known as the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple, where you have granite covering over much older limestone structures. And in these cases, again, even the Egyptologists, the classical Egyptologists, agree that the granite is 4th Dynasty, Old Kingdom, circa 2500 BC, and it's covering over, it's restoring something that's much older. They don't want to admit that the thing that's being restored is thousands of years older, but geologically it's very clear. And when you look at the third pyramid, people who have been there, they'll recognize that the third pyramid has a very heavy coating of the same red Aswan granite on it. And I think this again is an indication that they are restoring in dynastic times a much older structure. So the answer to your question, are the pyramids older? I think the cores of them, the original pyramids, are much older, but they were being reused and restored in classical Old Kingdom dynastic times, which is 4,500 years ago unto itself.
Okay. I know when I talked to Stephen Mailer, he had said that the oral tradition of Egypt says that the pyramids date back 12,000 years as well.
Yeah, there are all these oral traditions and ancient traditions that it goes back to that earlier period. In fact, this is sometimes referred to as Zep-Tepe.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be confused with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, but in Egypt you have the concept of Zep-Tepe, which is the original times, the origin times, the earliest times of civilization, and civilization was supposed to have flourished back then, sort of went through a fall, and then re-emerged later. And the ancient Egyptians themselves, so the ancient Egyptians 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, talked about this earlier period, which I would place at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, and they referred to it as Zep-Tepe, the time when gods were among the humans, when civilization had its first flowering, and they talk about this as being a period almost like a biblical, fall from grace, and then there was a demise, and then they had to rediscover civilization. So, yeah, these ancient traditions talk about what I think we are now learning based on geology and archaeology.
Okay. I did have a question from a listener. Jack in Vegas asks, at one time the Nile River ran right along the Giza Plateau. The ancients could have sailed right down to the pyramids, and he'd like to know how long it would have taken in geologic time to move the Nile to its present location, and would this be a good indicator of the age of the monuments?
He's absolutely right that the Nile came much closer at one point to the Giza Plateau than it does now, but it's not, in my opinion, as a geologist, a good indicator of the age of them. The Nile, like any major river, when left to its own devices, can migrate back and forth relatively quickly. So you could, the Nile was probably much closer 12,000 years ago, but it could have been closer in intermediate periods also. And there are indications that was. So, people don't realize how quickly geologically rivers can migrate. We're talking in terms of centuries to millennia. Nowadays, people don't want rivers to migrate, so they put all kinds of banks around them, they put levees around them, they enclose them. And this is a major problem when you look at rivers around the world, including the Nile. So in modern times, they've done a lot to keep the Nile in one course, building levees on either side. They built the Aswan high and low dams to try and control the Nile. People do the same thing with the Mississippi. So from a geological perspective, we tamper with rivers the way they shouldn't be tampered with. But I do want to make a point because he brings up a very good point. I think that in very ancient times, when I say very ancient times, just think in terms of 10, 12,000 years ago, the Nile was much closer to the Giza Plateau. And one thing that I found seismically, and I don't know if I talked about this on the show last time or not, but something that a fellow named Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist who I worked with back in the early 90s, we were looking at underground structures, or I basically wanted mineralogical data and weathering data around the Sphinx to either confirm or refute my redating of the Sphinx, and it confirmed it. But something we found was that there's a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx, and some people have suggested that this is the Hall of Records. Edgar Cayce had predicted there would be something around there. And there's no good entrance to it, no known entrance to it. But something else we found was that when you go just due east of the Great Sphinx and the Sphinx Temple, what's known as the Sphinx Temple, right in front of it, under what is currently sand, there's actually a major cliff. And I believe that back at this very remote period, the Nile came very close to that cliff, and you would have actually been on the Nile. You could have been on a boat on the Nile, sailing along the Nile. The Nile goes from north to south, so you'd be sailing south. If you're following the Nile, you would look up to the left and you would see this cliff, you would see the Sphinx, and you would see the Sphinx Temple up on the cliff, and it would have been a very dramatic sight. And I've also speculated that in the side of that cliff, there may have been an entrance leading into a tunnel system that would go into the chamber that's now under the paws of the Sphinx. So it was probably a very different situation, thousands and thousands of years ago, and that included a different position for the Nile.
Okay, all right. Well, let's move on to some of the work you've done with parapsychology and some of the sort of cutting edge science you have in the new book. And there was you squeezed a lot of cutting edge research into this book in just like the last chapter.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think one of the important points I'd like to make is, and you mentioned this earlier, these ancient civilizations, particularly these very, very ancient civilizations going back to the end of the last ice age, they may have been more advanced than us in some respects. And that respect in particular might be what we now call parapsychology or paranormal phenomena. Things in terms of consciousness, what they could do with their minds, how they could use their minds to access information or to even affect real world phenomena. Very different mentality, very different worldview than we have today. And I think, sort of cutting edge research in certain fields is maybe just starting to approach what they knew and even took for granted.
Now, I know you've been on the CPAC conference that Walter Cruttenden puts on.
It's on Procession and Ancient Knowledge. Very good conference that he puts on almost every year. He's not doing it in 2013, but I understand from him inside knowledge he's going to do it in 2014 again.
Yeah, he said he was.
Yeah, okay, good. So he's made that public.
But now, what do you think about his theories with the cycles of time, that we move into a more spiritual level of consciousness and then back into a dark age over a course of 24,000 years?
Well, it's not just his theory. I mean, he would be the first, I think, to say that this is actually a tradition that goes back to the ancients themselves.
Yeah, he's corrected me on that numerous times.
Yeah, but he's certainly been a modern proponent of it. And it's interesting that when you look at ancient cultures around the world, you have these types of traditions. So in the Hindu, Indian tradition, you have the concept of the Yuga Cycles, and he in particular has emphasized the Yuga Cycle and the concept of going, through the different cycles, the different spiritual ages. And he has tied, and he wasn't the first one to do it, but he and other people have tied this to the processional ages. And I'm sure everyone knows what the processional ages are, but the age is based on the zodiacal signs. So we're currently at the end of the age of Pisces, and we're going to go into the age of Aquarius. Before the age of Pisces, we had the age of Aries, etc., etc. So you go through these processional ages, and those that subscribe to this generally suggest that every age has its own sort of psychic aspects, its own consciousness, its own characteristics that affect the world as a whole. And when you talk about the Yuga cycles, it's the same type of thing. And even the classical Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, they talked about cycles like this one of the most common ways to discuss it is in terms of a gold age, silver age, bronze age, iron age, and that you go through these different ages. And something like the gold age, there may be a different mentality, maybe more emphasis on consciousness and higher levels of consciousness, versus the iron age being more physical and material. The Mayans talked about having cycles or different, what they call suns, and going through world ages. So this is a very, very very ancient, and I would say universal concept, that we go through cycles, we go through different periods. And when you see something like that across cultures around the world, I think you have to take it seriously and say, well, maybe there's some commonality here, and maybe it's expressing something real. And my own research indicates that that is absolutely the case, that there is something to it.
Now, the Golden Age would be the time period of places like Göbekli Tepe and the first time of the Egyptian culture, wouldn't it?
That's absolutely correct. When you correlate this with the Yuga Cycle in particular, as Walter Crittenden has and others have been speaking about it, and I've done seminars on this at conferences, focused on the Yuga Cycle. It turns out that Göbekli Tepe, Zep Tepe of the Egyptians, that golden time, that first period of civilization, ties in with the Satya Yuga, or the golden age of the Yuga Cycle. And at that time, according to Hindu beliefs, as I understand them, they saw it as a golden age, but as a golden age that was less material and more spiritual, if you would, or different levels of consciousness. Some of them even talk explicitly about during the golden age, there would have been more, we'll call it mind control, or more ability to control one's mind and affect real world changes with the mind. More ability to do things that, in the modern age, people would refer to as paranormal or parapsychological, telepathy, that type of thing, telepathic connections, and that these were much more common at that time, in that type of age.
Now, you've done some work with parapsychology and psi in particular, and have found a connection to the sun.
Yes, absolutely. There's absolutely a connection to the sun, and depending on where the sun is, or really the connection in my assessment is more to the geomagnetic flux, but the geomagnetic flux on Earth is directly related to solar activity. So there is this solar connection, and we don't understand it fully, but depending on the activity of the sun, the level of activity, it affects the magnetic field on Earth, the geomagnetic field, and there's a direct correlation between geomagnetic fluctuations and things like telepathic phenomena, or what sometimes people call remote viewing types of phenomena, or poltergeist types of phenomena. These are all correlated, and there have been studies, interestingly, looking at correlations between these types of phenomena and the geomagnetic flux. And interestingly, the geomagnetic flux, or the geomagnetic changes, have been tallied and kept track of since the late 19th century, and people have recorded when they've experienced certain types of phenomena, and there's a direct correlation between one and the other, which is really outstanding, in the sense that the only way to explain it, if you're a skeptic, is to say that everyone decided to have a big conspiracy, and they would all report telepathic experiences when the geomagnetic parameters were such and such, and not at other times. Most people have been aware of geomagnetic parameters.
Right, and what I found odd, I would almost think that psychic ability would be increased when solar radiation and magnetic fields were lower, but it's the opposite, isn't it?
It seems to be the opposite. And again, we don't understand exactly. We don't exactly understand, what the causative factors are. Because one thing I will say this, it's a classic thing, correlation is not causation. Is there some other factor that's driving both or affecting both?
Hmm.
That's not impossible either. Uh, there certainly are correlations. And we found, and I talked about this in Forgotten Civilization too, it's not just things like consciousness studies or paranormal phenomena, but it's now been found that certain radioactive isotopes, radioactivity is supposed to be an independent phenomena. It's not supposed to be affected by anything, but now it's been found that at least some radioactivity is affected by solar positions where we are in our orbit around the sun. It's affected by things like solar flares. So life is a lot more complicated.
And a lot more interconnected from this type of research.
Yeah, than a lot of people want to admit, or a lot than is expressed by the classical point of view of physics and chemistry and biology and psychology.
Now, what, uh, like, so if radiocarbon dates and stuff can be altered by where we are in space and by all these interconnections, could they turn out at some point to be way off?
Well, the simple answer is yes. It's just not inconceivable. Uh, and actually, as a geologist, I will make the comment here. It's not clear how much they would be off or how much it would affect things. But yeah, there's the distinct possibility that our calibrations in terms of years could be off. Now, what is robust, what will hold up, is something that in my own work I tend to emphasize, even though everyone likes to talk about dates and, 9,700 BC for the end of last ice age, that type of thing. As a geologist, what's most important to me is relative chronology. What came first, second, third, fourth, and fifth? And
Mm-hmm.
that, in my opinion, is much more stable, much more robust. So even if we end up recalibrating some of these dates, and it turns out instead of being 9,700 BC, it's actually 10,700. I'm just making up numbers, or 8,700. What is important to me is the relative chronology. What came first, second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. And that can be established on a lot of bases and is established typically geologically on things other than simply radioactive dating or isotopic dating. It's based on stratigraphy of where you find rock formations, what you find under something else, correlations like that. So that's actually much more robust and solid, and I think will absolutely stand the test of time, even if we have to refine isotopic dating because of fluctuations in radioactive decay rates.
And one of the other things you talk about in there is a really fascinating experiment that has to do with DNA and water.
Oh, yes.
And that was just kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, because it turns out, and this is the basis of a lot of people would say, this in a way confirms homeopathy, that type of thing. But it turns out that water is incredibly complex. It can hold nanostructures, structures. It responds to electromagnetic and energy fields. And what's been found is that water can essentially, in the case of the DNA, it can encode the information to resequence or reconstruct DNA, even though it's not supposed to be able to do this. And it can, one body of water can essentially pass this information on to another body of water, essentially we'll call it telepathically. What's really happening is that it encodes information and it can give it off under the right parameters essentially as energy or frequency, which can then be passed on to another, um, isolated body of water, and apparently form nanostructures in the water that then, if you introduce the right chemicals, it can resequence them to reconstruct, for instance, DNA or virtually anything else. So essentially the concept of water memory and passing on information. And, this in some ways I think confirms traditional homeopathy, and also confirms the traditional concept of water being so important, and not all water is the same. Well, it may be pure H2O in every case, but that doesn't mean it's not encoding information. In fact, all the information now suggests that water can encode information in these very complex nanostructures, microstructures within water, even though it's still just pure hydrogen and oxygen.
Well, I know, if I'm remembering right, there was someone in Japan who had done tests on water when they were trying to impress emotions on them, and showed that they actually related differently depending on what kind of emotions were.
Exactly. What's his name? Emoto, I think. But the concept is that you can pray over water, or you can curse water, that type of thing, and it will take on different microstructures, different nanostructures, and go into either a chaotic state or a beautiful ordered state, that type of thing. And then if, say, a being, organism, whether it's human or something else, ingests that water has different effects.
And what does that say about our consciousness and our emotions? I mean, because if we can project something onto something like that, it argues against us being kind of stuck inside of a body.
Oh, yeah. No, actually, I think one of the big lessons of parapsychology and serious studies of the paranormal is exactly what you're saying. We're not stuck inside our body. In fact, one of the myths, and I'll use that term, falsehoods, if you would, of modern ways of thinking is that whatever you think in your head stays in your head. It's not the case at all. Whatever you think, whatever you're conscious of, whatever you sort of wish or desire, and I don't mean that in a selfish way, but in many cases it's strong emotions. For instance, if you are carrying strong negative emotions, those do not stay in your head. They affect materially entities, beings, things, material objects around you. It's absolutely a falsehood that thinking evil thoughts has no effect on the world at large if you don't act on them. I could put it that way. There's a good reason that a lot of the ancient traditions, whether it's Judeo-Christian or others, you're not supposed to not only act evil, in evil ways, but you're not supposed to think evil thoughts. And the point is that they actually have a real effect.
Now, one of the things you talk about in the book too are the elf waves that are created by the Earth, and how that might also affect our consciousness. And do you think some of these structures were meant to take advantage of that? Some of these ancient sites?
Yeah. Actually, the very long wavelength, low frequency, so extremely long wavelength, extremely low frequency, the elf waves, as they're sometimes called, ELF, for extremely low frequency waves. And I think these are absolutely vital to humans, human functioning, human consciousness. We know that based on modern encephalograms, that type of thing, our deepest levels of consciousness are at these very low frequency, long wavelengths. And that ties right in with what are known as human resonances, which is sort of the natural resonance of the Earth, on the order of 7 or 8 beats per second, Hertz. 7 or 8 Hertz, and then resonances of that at about 14, 15, etc. And when we're functioning properly that's where our brain is in terms of wavelengths. And it seems to tie right in when we're sleeping, we're getting good night's sleep. Your brain is in those resonances. And it seems very clear to me that many of the ancient monuments may have been built to enhance this. There have now been studies demonstrating that. And I'm talking electromagnetic waves, but sound waves also have the same effect. And in fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but sound and electromagnetic waves are very intimately related when it comes to humans and human consciousness. So you can actually have sound waves that convert to electromagnetic waves and vice versa at these very low frequencies. And something else I want to mention, talk about solar activity. The basic Schumann resonances, these basic resonances are actually physically a function of electromagnetic waves, essentially light, but not in the visible range, traveling around the Earth, how long it takes for a wave to travel around the Earth in the cavity between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere. And that changes as solar activity fluctuates. So it actually affects Schumann resonances and therefore ties back and affects consciousness and probably affects some of the paranormal abilities that we talked about previously. So all of these things are interrelated. In some ways, going into caves can protect you, or going into stone structures. And what do we have around the world? Lots of ancient megalithic stone structures. These can sort of protect you, or I'll say filter out extraneous waves and get you down to these basic low-level elf waves, these basic level frequencies, these Schumann resonances. And then this can be used, I believe, to enhance consciousness, to gain what people talk about as higher states of consciousness. When people go into deep meditation, this is what they're attempting to do. And I'll say on the negative side, with modern civilization, we bombard ourselves with all kinds of electromagnetic frequencies that are frankly unnatural, and I think agitate us from a mental consciousness point of view, and get in the way of deep thinking, in terms of get in the way in terms of should we say higher levels of consciousness. There's some suggestions that telepathy may be a multi-functional thing. There may be different forms of telepathy, but one thing I've speculated, I'm not the only one to do this, is that certain forms of telepathy may in fact be dependent on these elf waves, these extremely low frequency waves. They may essentially be what I call the telepathic carrier in some cases, and they are disruptive when you have higher frequency waves and you're bombarded by higher frequency waves, which unfortunately in modern society we're bombarded by this all the time. The very fact that both you and I are in some kind of enclosure with currents running through the walls and electricity and all that type of stuff, that's in America typically at about 60 hertz, frequency of 60 hertz. That's disrupting these more fundamental waves and affecting us. People using cell phones, I mean, there's nothing worse. So I don't want to go off on tangents, but we have a very different society than some of these ancient societies, and part of it is just what we subject ourselves to with modern technology.
Now, I know they at one point were talking about, like, if we sent people to Mars, that there seems to be some physical reliance on the wave structure of the Earth that might actually make it very difficult for somebody to go to.
Yes, exactly. This ties in with it because we, on the surface of the Earth, we are tuned, I'll use the term Schumann resonance because that's the technical term for it. We are tuned to these Schumann resonances. We're probably dependent upon them for our brains and our consciousness, and those are two different things. But for both of them, to function properly. And if you go for extended periods of time without being subjected, without, sort of starved of Schumann resonances, these fundamental electromagnetic waves, we frankly don't know what the implications would be. This is a crude analogy, but the electromagnetism, light is a type of electromagnetism. If you were all of a sudden deprived of light for long periods of time, and it has nothing to do with whether you can see or not, but you need light even if you're a blind person for certain metabolic functions. We were deprived of Schumann resonances for periods of time. It could be very severe, I think, indeed. And so it's been suggested, I've heard of suggestions where if you have long-term space travel to Mars or interplanetary space, that type of thing, that maybe you would need to produce, or people would try to produce, artificial Schumann resonances as a background electromagnetic phenomenon for people to live in.
And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of John Keel at all. But
tell me his work. I may be, but just am not recognizing the name now.
The Mothman Prophecies is probably as well known.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And one of the things he talks about, he actually had a whole book on different frequencies and stuff called The Eighth Tower, but in the Mothman Prophecies, he talks about a point where he was down in the TNT area, and he got stopped at a point where he couldn't walk past it, and his theory was that it was generating elf waves in such a way that it was causing irrational fear in him.
Yes. Actually, I'm not familiar with his work on that in particular, what you were just expressing, but to me that makes perfect sense.
And so it may have a paranormal connection to the Earth as well.
Yeah. So, I think that could well be the case.
All right, let's. There was a whole bunch. There's so much stuff in your book. Seriously, you packed so much into here. Even if it's small snippets, you managed to pack a lot of information into those small bits. Like one of the things you talked about is the quantum entanglement of diamonds and how that affects, that's something that's only supposed to happen on a microscopic scale, and here we've done it on a macroscopic scale.
Exactly, which is actually very exciting. It's a major breakthrough when you can get macroscopic diamonds to entangle a quantum level. This was something, I remember studying quantum physics and whatnot, and this was not supposed to happen. People, and I want to make the general point here, that even though quantum entanglement, quantum phenomena have been acknowledged by mainstream science, it's cutting-edge physics, there was always still this dichotomy, which I felt in some ways just made people feel good, that there was this belief that, okay, these quantum effects only happen at the sub-microscopic level. They're not going to have macroscopic effects. So even though you could, quote, believe in quantum mechanics, it didn't need to affect your everyday worldview because it was only a phenomenon that would manifest at the quantum level. It wouldn't manifest at the macroscopic level. And now things with like entangled diamonds, we're realizing this is not the case whatsoever, that quantum effects can manifest at the macroscopic level, which to me just seems quite logical, that for a long time was denied, I think, as a way of people saving their everyday worldview, their everyday paradigm.
All right. One of our listeners has a question I'm not sure that you'll be able to answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. He says, Eric wants to know, is there any validity that 432 hertz is the true key of A rather than 440 hertz?
I've heard that that's the case, but the true, what was it? The true key
of A.
Of the note.
Yeah.
A note. I'm not a musician.
All right.
No, I'd have to talk to my musician friends about that. And I don't know what is the true. I don't know what it means to be the truth. That the true A versus the non-true A.
So there are a couple others.
But I've heard that too. I don't know. I just don't know.
couple other things I wanted to ask you about, get your opinions on stuff. One of them, and I believe you mentioned this in the book. If not, I know you've talked about it before. What's your opinion of the Bosnian pyramid?
Oh, I do mention that in the book, I think in one of the appendices or something like that. I don't want to sound too harsh, but the Bosnian pyramids are not ancient. I'll put it that way. Are there pyramids there? I guess there are pyramids there now because Samir Osmanagic is carving natural hills into pyramids. So if you want to call them pyramids, you can call them pyramids. But they're 21st century. I've spent a couple of weeks there. I spent a couple weeks with Samir Osmanagic on site. And I say this pretty bluntly in the book. I mean, he's a fraud. He's a charlatan. And it's a real shame because he is, in my assessment as a geologist, he's got absolutely natural, it's a very interesting geology, but they are natural hills, which he's carving into fake pyramids. And he's perpetuating a fraud. I mean, I'm being blunt and honest, and I don't want to sound nasty, and some people will attack me for that, but it's the truth.
Well, it seems, if anything, it would help your work if they were real.
It would absolutely help my work. I would love for them to be real. See, this is one of the ironies of it. I'm not gaining anything personally by saying they're frauds. I'm just calling it the way I see it, and that's the way I've had to live. And I feel I have to live my life. I have to be honest. And I went there hoping they were real. I didn't know what exactly to expect. It would certainly bolster a lot of things I've been talking about for decades. If they were real, it would help me in every way. But the fact is they're not real. And for what it's worth, a lot of other people have come to the exact same conclusion. The European archaeological community has, published statements about that, agreeing that they're not real. They're perpetuating a fraud, and it's a real shame because, the last thing I think. What sometimes it's referred to as alternative archaeology, and I hate that term. But sort of the alternative archaeology or the alternative historians, the last thing that one needs when one's in a controversial field to begin with is for someone to perpetuate a fraud and then have the conventional status quo say, be able to point to that and say, aha, you see, that's fraudulent, and then they can throw everything else out, sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I've had that experience with people who have said to me, this is all nonsense, etc. Well, where are you coming from? What do you mean by that? And they'll point to the Bosnian pyramids, which clearly are nonsense, and then they'll want to dismiss everything else along with it. So I think he's causing a lot of damage. And I understand where he's coming from. Bosnia is the former Yugoslavia. Was a war-torn country. They people, when I go there, those that are the believers, they see this as a matter of national pride. I had people even say to me, how could I question the authenticity of the Bosnian pyramids? I was being anti-Bosnian by questioning whether they were real or not. They just want to toe the party line. It becomes a nationalistic thing. It brings in money to the area. He's sort of a local hero, that type of thing. But, to me, you have to have a baseline of reality. So that's right. My opinion. Have you been there?
No. No, I thought it was really interesting when I heard about it, but
a lot of people do, and I was talking to people just this past month who have been there and went there thinking it was real, and then coming back, we'll put it this way, disappointed, saying that it really wasn't. I have, I think, a link from my website, a Dutch film crew who went over there thinking it was real, only to find out it was a fraud and end up making documentary. I think they called it The Biggest Hoax in History or something like that, with a question mark behind it. But come to the conclusion, it is a big hoax, and we're very disappointed. I mean, they didn't want to make a documentary about a hoax.
Right.
But they came to the conclusion that that's what it was. So it's, and I'm sure people will attack me for saying that, but I just have to call it the way I see it.
Oh, good. That's what people need to do.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't keep your integrity, then what do you have?
And once you lose it, it's not something you can easily get back either.
Exactly. So I could tell you a lot of Bosnian pyramid stories, but the bottom line is they're not ancient pyramids.
All right. What have you seen or have any opinion on this Baltic Sea anomaly?
I have not seen it. I mean, I don't know that anyone's seen it. I think it's basically been viewed remotely. I mean, not remotely in the sense.
Well, they have gone down and dived on it.
Have they dived on it now?
Yes. Yeah.
I haven't seen photographs of the actual diving. I've only seen, I guess it was early on, maybe some radar scans, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I honestly don't know what to make of it. I've learned, and this ties in with Yanaguni. It ties in with the Bosnian pyramids. It ties in with things like Markawasi in Peru. I'm naming things where I've actually been there and visited them and dived them and seen it with my own eyes. I found that as a general rule of thumb, for me nowadays, I don't want to comment on things unless I've seen them firsthand or been able to study the raw data firsthand, which with the Baltic anomaly, I haven't been able to. And I don't know what to think of it. Is it something that goes back thousands of years and is really amazing? Is it a World War II structure, as I've heard some people suggest? I just don't know.
Well, I would give the discoverers a lot of credit for not jumping to crazy conclusions and wanting to really investigate it thoroughly before they say anything. So
that's what you have to do. I mean, all the indications to me are as it falls into the category of a real anomaly that needs to be investigated, not something that's being faked.
Now, I don't know if you've done any research on this, but what about reports of giants in all these ancient sites around the world?
That's actually interesting. I was going to bring that up earlier with Easter Island, and then we got distracted. I think you probably know from reading my book, there are reports of giants on Easter Island. When the Dutch first, quote, discovered Easter Island in 1722, one of the lead officers reported that there were still living giants on Easter Island. He talks about the men being 12 feet tall, not all of the Easter Islanders, but that there was a race of Easter Islanders, that the men were 12 feet tall, that the Dutch, and the Dutch traditionally are not short people, that the Dutch could walk between their legs without bending over, that the women of this race were not quite so large, they were only 10 feet tall. But still, 10 or 12 feet tall individuals was giant by any modern standards. So this was reported for Easter Island. Of course, the status quo conventional archaeologists and historians dismiss this as just, nonsense. One archaeologist said to me, well, yeah, they were 12 feet tall because they were standing on stilts. I think the Dutch would have noticed if a guy rode up. They talk about one coming out in a canoe, one of these, quote, giants. I think they would have noticed if they were standing on stilts while they were, coming out to meet the ship in their canoe.
Well, there seem to be a lot of old reports, especially in America, where they have these giant skeletons found in the mounds or around mound sites with like 2 rows of teeth and stuff, and you have them in the Indian legends as well.
So my point is that you have it in Easter Island, you have it in North America. This is something that you have legends of around the world, and it's very tantalizing. And I'm still waiting, though, for physical remains. And when I say still waiting, I'm not trying to sound skeptical. I'm saying we really need to find good physical remains, because there have been lots of reports of physical remains, but they seem to all disappear.
Yeah, they either disappear or, like, the Smithsonian supposedly has them but doesn't show them to anyone.
Show them to anyone, that type of thing. I wanted to draw another analogy, and I mentioned this in Forgotten Civilization. In Easter Island, as I was just mentioning, the Dutch reported when they first found the island in the early 18th century, there were these reports of giants still on the island. I've spoken to Easter Islanders, native of the island. One fellow in particular who said, yes, in his childhood or youth, he had seen giant human bones on the island. And I quizzed him, and he was very clear. He was not talking about cow bones or something like that. He's an artist, professional artist. He knows what human bones look like, and that these were definitely abnormally large bones. I also wanted to make the other point, which I think is important, and I talk about in the book. The Dutch, who were great traders around the world, so they were not only going to Easter Island in the West Indies, they were also going to the Dutch East Indies, as it became known, the area of Indonesia, for instance. And they reported in the 18th and 19th centuries that the Indonesians had all kinds of stories about not giants, but very little people, a race of very little people. Were very short, 3 feet tall or so, and apparently lived up in the mountains of the remote islands, and would come down sometimes and raid the villages and even steal babies, it was alleged, that type of thing. But that this was a distinct race of little people, and this was either dismissed as, again, nonsensical tales by modern scientists and historians, or they say, well, maybe they're referring to orangutans or, some kind of monkeys or apes or something like that. But in the last 10 years, new species of human has been discovered based on subfossil remains from the end of the last ice age, the so-called hobbits, Homo floresiensis, which is a distinct species of humans. They stood only 3.5 feet tall when they were adults, and they fit the description that the Dutch reported. They heard from the natives in Indonesia. So now we have to face the possibility that maybe in that case the Dutch were reporting good information. Maybe as late as just a couple of hundred years ago, Homo floresiensis, this distinct species of small humanoids, was alive in Indonesia. And going back to Easter Island giants, maybe the same possibility on the other end of the scale with giants is possible. That up until recent times, there were some outposts, if you would, some relic populations of a giant race.
All right. Well, we're slowly running out of time here. The way that modern science kind of blocks out things that don't fit, like your research on the Sphinx or these giants or anything. Do you see that sort of dogma, that grip of dogma, ever changing anytime in the near future?
Well, I would like to see it change, but do I think that's realistic? Not particularly. I think what happens is that certain areas, certain fields, certain theories, ultimately, you want to think ideally that the evidence becomes so overwhelming that you have to change. People have to change their minds. Realistically, what generally happens, and this is pretty well documented, is not that people change their minds, but the people with a certain mindset die off, either professionally or physically just die. And then a new generation comes in that's not quite so set in that way of thinking and can consider the new information, and then sort of a new dogma, a new paradigm starts to take over. And I think we're seeing that even now with the concept of ancient civilizations and when civilization arose. I think I'm seeing that, fortunately, in my own lifetime with my work on redating the Sphinx, for instance. But it's a slow, painful process. People don't want to give up their worldviews. They don't want to give up their paradigms. And it's not just at a conscious level. I think there's this deep-rooted subconscious fear of giving up your cherished worldview.
Oh, sure. And that's just a human thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's human nature, unfortunately.
All right. Well, your book is Forgotten Civilization. It's available everywhere.
Yes.
And
I hope.
Go
ahead.
on. Your website is robertschoch.com. You want to spell that for people?
Yes, it's robertschoch.com, and it's ROBERT, just like Robert, but the last name is SCHOCH. So it's ROBERTSCHOCH.com.
And you're. Go on.
Yeah, and from there, people can link to the book. They can link to, you mentioned it, Megalithomania in the Boston area in October. But most importantly, if they would like to go to Turkey with me later this month, in about 2 weeks, they should sign up right now. And there's a link on the website.
And it's also linked on wheredidtheroadgo.com, and that tour goes from the 15th to the 28th of June.
Correct. And it's going to be a great tour.
And the Megalithomania is the first time that's going to be in the U.S., isn't it?
I can't remember if it's the first time. I think it's the second time, but I actually was not involved with it the first time.
Okay.
But it's going to be right here in Quincy, Massachusetts, right outside the Boston area. I know from where I am in Boston, I'm just going to take the public transportation, so really close to Boston.
All right. Anything else people should know that you have coming up?
I'll be involved in that. Yeah, something else. Those in the Austin area, Austin, Texas, in September, I'll be doing a weekend workshop, and I'll be doing a lecture on Friday night and then a weekend workshop in Austin, Texas in September. So there's a link to that from my website also. Austin's a great place to be. So those in the Austin, Texas area, I would invite them, or if anyone wants to visit Austin, Texas, this is a good reason to go there.
All right.
Something else.
Okay. And again, robertschoch.com, SCHOCH is your website?
That's correct. And most important, I don't want to say most important, but I hope people will look into my book, Forgotten Civilization, for lots more on everything we've discussed and many other topics.
All right, and I would honestly, genuinely, highly recommend the book. It was a fascinating read and very well written.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right, Last Exit for the Lost is up next, taking out with some Psyche Corporation. We'll see you next week with David Metcalf.
Call me